The dust of the road was a fine, pale grit that clung to the hem of her light pink cheongsam, a ghost of the life she was leaving. Her father had not looked at her when he took the silver coins, his hand closing around them with a finality that felt like a stone dropping into a deep well. He had spoken only to the man who stood beside her, a figure so immense he seemed to block out the sun. "She is a good worker," her father had said, his voice thin and reedy against the vast silence of the territory. "Useless for sons, but her hands are quick." Anne kept her gaze fixed on the worn toes of her slippers. Useless. The word had been the refrain of her 20 years, a constant dull ache behind her ribs. The man, this buyer, said nothing. He simply waited, his patience as vast and unnerving as the mountains that rose up behind him. He was a creature of those mountains, with a wild, tangled beard the color of dried bracken, and hair that fell past his shoulders in a heavy, unkempt mass. His size was not just in his height, but in the sheer breadth of his shoulders, the thickness of his arms where the sleeves of his buckskin shirt were rolled to the elbow. When her father finally shuffled away without a backward glance, the man gestured with his head, a single, curt motion for her to follow. The path away from the dusty settlement was steep, winding up into the pines. He moved with a heavy, sure-footed gait, never once looking back to see if she was keeping pace. Anne followed, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Each step took her further from the known world, into a wilderness that felt ancient and indifferent. The air grew thinner, cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. There was no conversation, only the sound of his heavy boots on the trail and the soft, frightened whisper of her own breathing. They walked for hours, until the last vestiges of the world below were swallowed by the trees. His home was not a home at all, but a crude, one-room cabin huddled against a rock face, smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. It was a place of profound solitude, a fortress against the world. He stopped at the threshold and finally turned to look at her, his eyes a pale, startling gray in the shadow of his brow. He did not invite her in. He simply stood there, a silent giant, and she understood. This was her cage. For 3 days the silence was a living thing, a presence that filled every corner of the small, dark cabin. Anne claimed a space in the corner farthest from the door, a small patch of floor where she sat with her back to the rough-hewn logs, making herself as small as possible. The man, Gunner, moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture he had not yet decided where to place. He would rise before the sun, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and leave without a word. He would return in the evening, smelling of pine and sweat and blood, sometimes with a rabbit or a brace of birds that he would skin and cook over the fire. He ate with a singular focus, his large hands surprisingly deft. He would always leave a portion for her on a tin plate by the hearth, never looking at her, never speaking. She ate only when he was outside or had turned his back, the food tasting of ashes and fear in her mouth. On the 4th morning, a new sound began, sharp and rhythmic, the percussive thud of an axe splitting wood. It was close. Peeking through a crack in the ill-fitting door, she saw him working in a small clearing a short distance from the cabin. He was felling trees, stripping them of their branches with powerful, efficient swings. He was not gathering firewood. He was shaping logs, notching their ends with a precision that seemed at odds with his brute strength. He was building. The sound became the new shape of her days. The steady, relentless chop of the axe was a clock counting out her time in this strange, silent world. It was a sound of purpose, of creation, and it was entirely separate from her. She remained in the cabin, a silent observer in a life that was happening around her, but not to her. One evening he came in and set the plate of food down. He paused, his back to her. He gestured with his head toward the window in the direction of his work. "For you," he said. The words were rough, like stones grinding together, the first he had spoken directly to her since they arrived. For you. The phrase made no sense. She was a possession, a worker. You did not build things for a tool. The structure grew with astonishing speed. Each day Gunnar worked from the first hint of light until the shadows grew long and purple in the valley below. The walls rose, log by log, a small, square pen taking shape in the clearing. Anne found herself drawn to the window, watching him. She watched the play of muscles across his broad back as he lifted timbers that seemed impossibly heavy. She watched the intense concentration on his face as he fitted the notched logs together, his movements economical and certain. There was no wasted effort, no frustration, just a steady, powerful progression. He seemed a part of the mountain itself, as elemental and unyielding as the rock and timber he worked with. As the days passed, a subtle shift occurred within her. The suffocating fear began to recede, replaced by a dull, aching curiosity. She started to venture out of the cabin when he was preoccupied with his work, staying close to the doorway. She swept the packed dirt floor with a crude broom she found in a corner. She washed the 2 tin plates in the nearby creek, the cold water a shock to her hands. They were small acts, insignificant, but they were her own. They were choices. One afternoon, as she was gathering kindling near the woodpile, he stopped his work and walked toward the creek. He returned with a full bucket of water and set it down near the cabin door, a few feet from where she stood, frozen. He did not look at her, did not speak, but the gesture was plain. He had seen her trips to the creek with the small pot. He was saving her the labor. She did not know what to do, what to say. Thank you felt like too much, an intimacy she had not earned and did not want. So she said nothing, merely watched him walk back to the rising walls of the new cabin. Below them, the world continued on, unseen. She imagined the people in the settlement, the way they must have watched her being led away, the whispers that must have followed. The man had bought the useless Chinese girl. What did a man like that want with a wife? The thought made her skin crawl. The rhythmic thud of his axe was the only answer, a sound that promised nothing and explained even less. The roof was the final piece, a gentle slope of split-shake shingles that he laid with meticulous care. The cabin was finished. It was small, barely larger than the one he occupied, but it was new. The pale, stripped logs gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the air inside smelled clean of fresh-cut pine and earth. There was a cot built into one wall, a small, rough table, and a single stool. It was stark, but it was a complete space, a place unto itself. He stood back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned his gaze on her, where she stood hesitantly by the door of his cabin. He did not walk over. He simply pointed toward the new building with his chin. "Yours," he said. The word traveled across the clearing, clear and unambiguous. It wasn't a command, it was a statement. A transfer of ownership, perhaps, but not in the way she had expected. She had been bought, but he was giving her a place that was not his own. She gathered her few things, a spare set of undergarments, a comb her mother had given her, the worn cheongsam on her back. Walking across the clearing felt like crossing a great divide. She stepped over the threshold of the new cabin. Her cabin. The door, which he had hung that morning, swung shut with a solid click, and for the first time in her life, she was in a room, alone, that belonged to her. The distance between the two cabins was perhaps 50 feet, but it felt like a mile. It was a border, a boundary he had built with his own hands. She could see his cabin from her window, and he could see hers, but the space between was a declaration of respect for her solitude. Later that evening he approached her door. He did not knock, but stood a few feet away, a large silhouette against the setting sun. "I do not know your name," he said, his voice a low rumble. She opened the door a crack, her heart beating a steady, cautious rhythm. Anne. The name felt foreign on her own tongue, a thing she had not had cause to use. He repeated it, the sound strange and soft in his deep voice. Anne. He seemed to be testing its weight. I am Gunner. He stated it simply, then turned and walked back to his own cabin, leaving her with the two names hanging in the quiet air, a fragile bridge beginning to form across the empty space. A quiet rhythm began to establish itself, dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by words. Each morning Gunner would leave, a rifle slung over his shoulder, and melt into the trees. Anne would tend to her small world. He had left a small sack of seeds on her doorstep one morning, beans, squash, and some hardy greens. She turned over a patch of soil near her cabin, her hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. The act of planting, of coaxing life from the ground, was a balm. It was a task that answered only to her own care. She cooked what he provided, the game he brought back from his hunts. After her own small meal, she would carry a plate of food over and leave it on the weathered stump that served as a porch for his cabin. She would be gone before he returned, but when she looked out later, the plate would be empty. He never mentioned it, and she never waited for thanks. It was an exchange, a silent conversation spoken in the language of survival and shared space. The mountain itself was becoming less of a threat. She learned to distinguish the cry of a hawk from the call of a jay, the rustle of a deer in the undergrowth from the whisper of the wind in the pines. The towering peaks that had once seemed like prison walls now felt like guardians, their stony faces changing with the light, marking the passage of the day. One evening he returned later than usual, a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his shirt. He moved stiffly, his face pale beneath his beard. He had a long, deep gash on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly. He sat heavily on the stump, fumbling with a strip of cloth. Anne watched from her doorway, a war of instinct raging inside her. To help was to invite closeness, to cross the carefully constructed boundary. To do nothing was to watch him suffer. Hesitantly, she filled a bowl with water from her bucket and found a clean rag. She walked across the clearing, her steps feeling loud in the twilight silence. She knelt before him and held out the bowl. He looked from her face to the water, his gray eyes unreadable. For a long moment he did not move. Then he slowly extended his arm. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm. His skin was warm, his muscles tense beneath her fingers. It was the first time they had touched since he had taken her from her father. When she was done, she wrapped the arm tightly with the cloth. "Thank you," he rasped, the words seeming to cost him a great effort. She only nodded, gathered the bowl, and retreated to the safety of her own cabin. The need for supplies eventually became unavoidable. Salt, flour, coffee, things the mountain could not provide. Gunner announced his intention one morning, his voice flat. "I am going to the settlement." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "Do you need anything?" The question surprised her. He had provided for all her physical needs without asking. This was different. This was an acknowledgement of a want, not just a need. She thought for a moment, the image of her worn pink cheongsam, its seams frayed, flashing in her mind. "Thread," she said, her voice quiet. "Pink thread." It was a small, foolish request, a tether to a self she was no longer sure existed, but it was the only thing she could think to ask for. He gave a short, sharp nod and was gone. The silence he left behind was profound. For the first time, Anne realized that the sounds of his existence, the chopping of wood, the scrape of his boots on stone, even his quiet breathing she could sometimes hear from across the clearing at night, had become a part of her landscape. The mountain felt emptier without him, the solitude shifting from a state of being to a feeling of loneliness. It was an unsettling revelation. He was gone for 2 days. She found herself watching the path down the mountain, straining for any sign of his return. When he finally appeared, a heavy sack slung over his shoulder, an unfamiliar wave of relief washed over her. He walked to her cabin and set the sack on her step. Inside, amongst the flour and salt, was a small wooden spool of pink thread. But underneath it was something else. A large, neatly folded bolt of plain brown cotton fabric. It was sturdy, practical, and completely unadorned. He had seen the state of her dress. He had understood the unspoken need behind the frivolous request. He was standing by his own cabin watching her. "They stare," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing, low and hard. "The people in town, they talk." He did not need to elaborate. She knew what they would say. She was his property, his strange, foreign pet. Gunner's jaw was tight. Let him talk. It was a dismissal, but it was also a shield. He was placing himself between her and the judgment of the world below. A summer squall blew in from the west, a sudden and violent affair that turned the sky a bruised purple gray. Rain came down in blinding sheets, drumming against the roof of her cabin with a relentless roar. Anne sat at her small table, watching the water run in rivulets down the single window pane. A steady drip began near the hearth, a dark spot spreading on the wooden floor. The door was suddenly flung open, and Gunner filled the space, rain streaming from his hair and beard, his buckskin shirt plastered to his massive frame. He strode in without a word, his eyes immediately finding the leak. He placed a bucket under it, the drops echoing loudly in the small space. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a hungry animal. It was clear he would not be returning to his own cabin until it passed. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, seeming too large for it, his presence overwhelming. The silence, usually a comfortable buffer between them, was now charged and heavy. Anne felt a strange compulsion to fill it. She gestured to the pot simmering over her small fire. "There is stew," she offered, her voice barely audible above the storm. He looked at her, then at the pot, and gave a slow nod. She ladled some into a bowl and set it on the table. He sat on the stool, which creaked in protest, and they ate. They did not speak, the only sounds the clink of spoons against tin and the roar of the storm. The shared meal, the enforced proximity, changed the texture of the air between them. When he was finished, he did not get up to leave. He stared into the fire, his hands resting on his knees. "I had a family once," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't catch it. "Down in the flatlands. A wife, a daughter." He spoke to the flames, not to her. "Fever took them, both in a week." He fell silent, the story hanging in the air, spare and brutal. There was nothing for me there after that. The silence in the house was louder than any storm. He looked around her small, simple cabin. "The silence in these mountains is better. It is an honest silence." He had given her a piece of his past, a key to understanding the deep well of quiet within him. She said nothing, offering no empty words of comfort. She simply listened, her own silence becoming a vessel to hold his. The day after the storm, the world felt washed clean. The air was crisp, and the sunlight, when it broke through the clouds, seemed sharper. The space between their two cabins no longer felt like a border. It was just a patch of ground they both occupied. Gunner began to find small tasks to do around her cabin. He rehung a shutter that had been knocked loose by the wind, his hammer blows neat and precise. He planed the edge of her door so it would no longer stick. They were small, quiet acts of care, offered without expectation or announcement. She, in turn, began to leave a lantern burning on her small porch when he was out late, a small beacon in the vast darkness of the mountain. It was a silent message. You are expected. You are seen. One evening, he did not return. The The sun bled out of the sky, and the stars began to prick the deep velvet of the night. Anne found herself pacing the length of her cabin, her stomach a tight knot of a new and unwelcome emotion. Fear. Not for herself, but for him. Every snap of a twig in the woods, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt through her. She lit the lantern, its small pool of light a feeble defense against the encroaching dark. It was nearly midnight when she finally saw him, a large shadow moving slowly up the path. He was limping, favoring his right leg. She met him at the edge of the clearing, her own rules of distance forgotten. He stopped when he saw her standing there, her face pale in the lantern light. "A cougar," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It will not bother the chickens again." He had not mentioned getting chickens. He must have been building a coop. He looked at her, at the worry etched on her face. "You were waiting." It was not a question. She could only nod, the gesture feeling enormous. He followed her gaze from her cabin to his own, then back to her. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. "In town," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "they ask questions about the woman on my mountain." He held her gaze, his pale eyes searching hers. "I tell them about my wife." He said the word carefully, letting it hang in the cool night air. It was not a demand or a declaration of ownership. It was a shield he was offering, a name for their strange alliance, a way to define them to a world that would never understand. The word settled over the clearing like a fine morning mist. Wife. It did not feel like a lie, nor did it feel entirely like the truth. It was a story they were beginning to tell, for the benefit of others, that was slowly becoming their own reality. It was a word of utility, of protection. It named her place beside him, not beneath him. It was a partnership forged in silence, on a mountain that kept the world at bay. An took the bolt of brown cotton fabric, and with the pink thread began to sew. She did not attempt to replicate the delicate binding form of a cheongsam. That dress, and the life it represented, felt like a skin she had shed. Instead, she cut and stitched a simple, loose-fitting garment, a practical dress with wide sleeves that would not hinder her work in the garden or at the hearth. The act of creating it was a quiet acceptance. She was no longer the useless daughter from a distant land. She was a woman of this mountain, and she was making the clothes to suit her life. One afternoon, as Gunnar sat mending a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly nimble, she spoke of her own past. She told him about her home, about being the fifth daughter in a family that craved sons. She told him of the whispers, the disappointed sighs, the ever-present feeling of being a burden. "My father said a daughter was like water spilled on the ground," she said, her voice even and calm, the words coming out without the sting of tears she had expected. "Once it leaves the bucket, it is of no use to the family." She was not looking at him, but at the distant line of peaks, their edges sharp against the blue sky. She was simply releasing the story, letting the mountain air carry it away. Gunnar stopped his work. He did not look at her, but his hands grew still. He sat that way for a long time, the leather and tools resting in his lap. The silence that followed was not empty. It was attentive. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble, devoid of pity but filled with a conviction that shook her to her core. He was wrong. That was all. 3 simple words. But in the vast, lonely landscape of her life, they were the first stones of a new foundation. The heat of summer began to yield, its oppressive weight lifting as the nights grew longer and cooler. A new crispness sharpened the air, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of autumn. The aspens in the lower valleys were the first to turn, their leaves shivering into brilliant patches of gold against the dark green of the firs. The mountain was preparing for winter, and so were its inhabitants. Gunner spent his days fortifying his own cabin, chinking the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, ensuring it was sealed tight against the coming cold and snow. His movements were deliberate, focused on the practicalities of survival. Anne watched him from her own cabin, a new sense of peace settling within her. The fear was long gone, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of belonging. She had her garden, her small home, and the silent, solid presence of the man across the clearing. One afternoon she put on the new brown dress. The fabric was coarse compared to the silk of her old life, but it felt strong, honest. It felt like her. She brewed a pot of tea, the fragrant steam a small comfort against the afternoon chill. She poured it into 2 mugs, and taking a breath, walked across the clearing. He was on a ladder, pressing the chinking into a high seam. He looked down as she approached, his expression unreadable. She held up a mug. He descended the ladder, his boots making soft thuds on the packed earth, and took it from her. His large, calloused fingers brushed against hers, a brief, warm touch that sent a small tremor through her. He drank the tea, his gaze moving from his heavily fortified cabin to her own, smaller, newer one. He looked at the single, thin curl of smoke rising from her chimney. "One roof is warmer than 2, he said. It was not a question. It was an observation, a simple statement of fact, as practical and unadorned as everything else about him. But beneath the practicality, it was an invitation to close the final distance, the 50 feet of earth that he himself had so carefully established between them. She looked at the 2 cabins, symbols of their separate solitudes, standing against the immense, beautiful indifference of the mountains. Then she looked back at him, at this giant of a man who had bought her and then built her a home, given her a name, and waited. A small, almost imperceptible nod was her only answer. It was enough. The long season of isolation was ending, and together they would face the winter.